Imagine a classroom where a young student walks in, excited for the new day, only to be met with harsh, demeaning comments from the very person who is supposed to teach and support him. It's a moment that no one should ever have to experience the sting of humiliation at the hands of someone in power. Now, picture this: that teacher, without realizing it, is about to cross paths with someone who can change everything. But this isn't just any student, and this isn't just any teacher. What happens next is a story of shock, retribution, and the truth that comes crashing down in a way no one expects. A teacher with a reputation for being strict, often crossing the line between discipline and cruelty, was known for her harsh words and quick judgments. Her attitude towards her students was well known, and many walked on eggshells in her class. But on this particular day, she thought she had an easy target: a student who seemed to fit the mold of someone who could be humiliated without much consequence. A black student, shy and reserved, sat at his desk, trying his best to stay out of the way, just like he always did. Little did she know, this was the day she would make a mistake she could never undo. The teacher's words were sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. The student, already feeling the weight of every awkward glance and whispered comment, tried to keep his head down. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want to be noticed. But her words didn't stop, and they grew worse. Her insults weren't just about his work, they were about who he was: his race, his background, his very existence. She believed, in that moment, she could break him, that he was just another student in a long line of disappointments. But what the teacher didn't know was that the student's family wasn't what she assumed. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. His father, a man with a history that few could ignore, was someone the teacher would have known very well. She had no idea who she was picking a fight with. The truth, though, was about to hit her hard, something she could never have anticipated. As the student sat there, taking in the insults, his heart raced, and the thought of standing up was almost too overwhelming. He wanted to fight back, but he also didn't want to make a scene. But this time, something changed. It was in that exact moment that the student decided to do something that would shock the teacher and the entire class, changing everything they knew about respect, power, and the consequences of underestimating someone. But here's where the story takes a turn. What happens next is a reveal that leaves the teacher speechless, and the entire classroom frozen in place. As the truth of his father's identity slowly unravels, the teacher realizes she's made a grave mistake, a mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her career. You won't believe who this student's father is, and how it changes everything. Stay tuned for what happens next, because what follows is a moment of reckoning, where the tables turn in a way that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and respect. The teacher had no idea what she was up against, and the student. He was about to show the world just how wrong she was. The day had started like any other. The classroom was filled with the usual hum of students preparing for the lesson ahead. Desks shuffled, papers rustled, and the teacher, Mrs. Hargrave, stood at the front, organizing her notes. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to teaching. If you didn't follow the rules, you felt her wrath. If you didn't meet her expectations, she made sure you knew it. Her reputation was both feared and respected. Students learned quickly to keep their heads down in her class, especially if you happened to be one of the quieter ones. The student, as always, sat near the back. He wasn't the loudest, the most outgoing, or the one who attracted attention. His clothes were simple, his posture reserved. He had always been the kind of student who blended in, hoping to get through the day without too much trouble. The last thing he wanted was to be noticed by Mrs. Hargrave, who had a way of zeroing in on the students she believed were underperforming. And that day, it was his turn. It wasn't the first time he'd been targeted by her. Over the past few weeks, she had made comments about his performance, or lack thereof. She'd make offhand remarks about how he wasn't trying hard enough, how he didn't belong in the advanced class. He knew it wasn't just about his grades. It was about who he was. His skin color. His background. He could tell by the way she looked at him sometimes like he was already a failure in her eyes, and there was nothing he could do to change it. That morning, Mrs. Hargrave had a particular way of speaking to him that felt different, more pointed, more biting. As the class settled into the lesson, she gave him a look from across the room, a sharp glance that made his stomach twist. He didn't know what it was about her today, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to end well. Her voice sliced through the quiet room as she called on him to answer a question he had been too distracted to prepare for. She already knew the answer. Everyone in the class knew. He wasn't as prepared as the others, and she was about to make sure everyone knew it. "Well," Mrs. Hargrave began, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "I guess we'll see if you've actually been paying attention today. Care to give it a try, or should I just mark you down as absent for the day?" The student's heart began to race. He could feel the eyes of his classmates boring into him, some of them already suppressing smiles. He wasn't the type to challenge the teacher. He didn't like confrontation. But Mrs. Hargrave had a way of making everyone uncomfortable, and today, she had decided he would be her target. He hesitated. The question she had asked was simple enough, but he wasn't sure if he had the right answer. Not that it mattered, she would probably find a way to make him look bad regardless of what he said. Taking a deep breath, he started to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think the answer is..." His words trailed off as he fumbled for the right response, his palms sweating. Mrs. Hargrave didn't give him the chance to finish. She crossed her arms, leaning forward with a smug expression. "Really?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You think? I thought you were supposed to be in this advanced class for a reason. If you're not even sure of the basics, maybe you should consider moving down to a different level." The class tensed. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others shot glances between the student and Mrs. Hargrave. He knew she was trying to make an example of him, to show the class that he didn't belong. But what stung the most was the way she spoke, like he was worthless, like he was nothing. But even then, he remained silent. He didn't know what to say. If he spoke up, she would just find another way to tear him down. And so, he sat there, his face burning, hands trembling, as she continued. "You know," she said, "it's not just your lack of effort in class that's troubling. It's your whole attitude. Maybe you don't take school seriously because it's not something people like you care about. Maybe you're just here because you have to be. Does that sound about right?" The words hit harder than any of the insults she had thrown at him before. It wasn't just about his grades or his performance now. It was about who he was. It was about the color of his skin, about the assumptions she was making about him, about his family. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, the shame creeping up his neck like a dark shadow. The room was silent. The students were all watching, waiting to see what he would do next. But he couldn't speak. Not because he didn't want to, but because every word he could think of felt like it would make the situation worse. He wasn't the kind of person who fought back. He didn't want to make it worse. He just wanted to disappear. But then, a sudden thought flashed in his mind. It was the one thing that could change everything. His father. His father wasn't just anyone. He was a man with a reputation that stretched far beyond the walls of that classroom. The student had never talked about his father at school. It wasn't something he liked to bring up. But right now, in this moment, the student realized something. He didn't have to sit there and take it anymore. Mrs. Hargrave had no idea who she was dealing with. She didn't know the power that lay behind his silence, the strength that ran through his veins. The student looked up, his eyes narrowing as Mrs. Hargrave continued her tirade. She was oblivious, still smirking, thinking she had won. But the truth was, she had no idea how deep she had dug herself into a hole. No idea who she had just decided to humiliate. His heart was still pounding, but something inside him was shifting. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about respect. This was about showing that, no matter how hard someone tried to bring you down, you could rise above it. He stood up, his legs unsteady at first, but then firming beneath him. The room went still. His classmates stared confused, uncertain of what was happening. Mrs. Hargrave stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing in surprise. The student's voice, when it came, was steady, stronger than he thought it would be. "I don't think you know who I am," he said quietly, but with a weight that drew everyone's attention. Mrs. Hargrave raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone more dismissive than curious. But the student didn't back down. He wasn't going to let her see how much she had rattled him. He wasn't going to let her make him feel small anymore. "You don't know who my father is," he said, each word ringing out with quiet authority. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Hargrave's eyes flickered for a moment, almost as if she were about to laugh it off. But there was something in the student's eyes, something that made her pause, just for a second. He wasn't the kind of student to speak up like this. Not in her class. Not in front of everyone. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "And why would that matter?" she said with a scoff, her eyes narrowing. "Your father has nothing to do with your behavior in this classroom." But the student wasn't finished. He took a deep breath, his voice growing firmer with each word. "You don't know who he is," he repeated, "but you will." At that moment, there was a shift in the air. Mrs. Hargrave's face flushed slightly, a crack in her confidence beginning to show. She had no idea what she had just walked into. And for the first time, the student saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the same doubt that everyone in the room was beginning to feel. Something was about to change, and it was bigger than anything anyone had expected. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, but the tension was undeniable. The student could feel the weight of every stare in the room, all on him now. He wasn't sure what he was about to do, but one thing was clear: whatever came next, it would be impossible for Mrs. Hargrave to ignore. The silence hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Mrs. Hargrave's eyes narrowed as she studied the student standing before her. She had always prided herself on maintaining control in the classroom, on having the power to shape her students, to keep them in line. But this was different. The quiet student, the one she had so easily dismissed, was now standing up to her, and she didn't know how to handle it. For a moment, she almost felt a flicker of fear, but she quickly smothered it with indignation. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice tight. The student didn't respond immediately, but the look in his eyes said everything. He wasn't going to back down. He was done being passive. Done being the invisible kid who could be pushed around and overlooked. Something in him had shifted, and Mrs. Hargrave's sharp tongue no longer held the same power over him. He stood there, chest rising and falling with each breath, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't speak at first, but his mind was racing, going over the words that he needed to say, the truth he needed to reveal. This wasn't just about his relationship with Mrs. Hargrave, it was about every moment he had ever felt underestimated, every time someone looked at him and saw nothing but the color of his skin. But the truth, the real truth, wasn't just about him, it was about who his father was. A man whose reputation preceded him in ways few could ignore. The student knew it. His classmates, even Mrs. Hargrave, didn't. Mrs. Hargrave was trying to recover, but she could feel the change in the room. Her authority was slipping, and she didn't like it. She took a step forward, her gaze hardening. "If you think your little stunt is going to get you any special treatment, you're mistaken," she said, voice laced with condescension. But the student wasn't intimidated anymore. He had already made the decision to speak his truth, to step out of the shadows. And so he did. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said quietly, but the calm in his voice made the words hit harder. "I'm telling you that you've messed with the wrong person. You don't know who I am, who my father is. You don't know what kind of power he holds, or how far his influence reaches." The tension in the room was palpable. The students, who had been watching this exchange in stunned silence, shifted in their seats. Some of them glanced at each other, unsure of what was happening. Others seemed to realize that the quiet student, the one they had all quietly written off, wasn't who he appeared to be. Mrs. Hargrave blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift. Her grip on the front of her desk tightened as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Are you really trying to make me afraid?" She scoffed, but the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. The student took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was steady, yet there was a certain power in it now, a quiet authority that made everyone listen. "You don't understand," he continued, his words deliberate. "My father is someone who doesn't tolerate disrespect. He doesn't let people like you walk all over others. And when he finds out what you've done, how you've treated me, he won't let this go. You've made a mistake, Mrs. Hargrave. And now, you'll have to face the consequences." The teacher's face strained of color. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was something close to it. Mrs. Hargrave had heard rumors. She had heard whispers about influential people, powerful figures who could change things with a single phone call, who could erase someone's career in an instant. But it was one thing to hear about it in passing, it was another to have it thrown in her face like this. "Your father," she began, but her voice faltered. She cleared her throat, attempting to recover. "What, do you think you can intimidate me with vague threats?" The student didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the weight of his words settle over her. He could see the flicker of doubt crossing her face, and for the first time, he could tell that she wasn't as confident as she'd been just moments before. She might not know who his father was, but she was starting to get an idea that this wasn't just some idle threat. The room, once filled with whispers of tension, now seemed to hold its breath. Every student in the class was caught in the whirlwind of this exchange. Some of them felt a sense of unease, unsure of what the student meant by his words. Others, however, could sense that something monumental was happening. This wasn't just about a student standing up for himself, it was about power, about respect, about the invisible lines that were often drawn and never questioned. But the student was questioning those lines. And he was demanding that others do the same. As Mrs. Hargrave fumbled for a response, one of the students, sitting near the front of the room, leaned over and whispered to their friend. "Who do you think he's talking about? His dad must be someone big." The student at the front of the room didn't answer. They just watched the scene unfold, eyes wide with curiosity. There were murmurs in the back of the room now, whispers that grew louder as the tension simmered, leaving the teacher to struggle in silence. For Mrs. Hargrave, this wasn't just a confrontation with one student. It felt like a confrontation with everything she had built: her image, her reputation as the teacher who controlled the room, who molded her students. She had always believed that if she could break them down, she could build them back up. But now, as this student stood before her, she realized that she had made a grave error. She had crossed a line, and the consequences were staring her in the face. In the midst of the tension, another student, a quiet girl who sat near the back, couldn't help but speak up. "You don't know who his dad is, do you?" she asked Mrs. Hargrave, her voice cutting through the stillness. Mrs. Hargrave turned to her, her gaze sharp. "What do you mean?" The student's eyes flickered toward the boy standing at the front of the room, her voice barely a whisper. "His dad is... well, he's not someone you want to mess with." Mrs. Hargrave didn't respond right away. The words hung in the air, and she realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just some idle boast. The student had said something that was starting to sink in, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the world she had created in that classroom. Back at his desk, the student slowly sat down, his gaze still locked on the teacher. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that things had changed. The power had shifted. No longer was he the quiet kid who kept his head down. He was someone with a story, with a voice that demanded to be heard. The bell rang just moments later, and the class filed out, their minds racing with what had just transpired. The whispers followed them into the hallways, growing louder with each step. And Mrs. Hargrave, standing at the front of the room, was left alone, her thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and fear. She didn't know what she had just stepped into, but she had a feeling she was about to find out. And the student, well, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days at school were in eerie quiet. The student couldn't help but notice the way his classmates kept their distance, almost as if they were all waiting for something to happen. Whispers filled the halls. The teacher's reputation as someone who maintained strict control over her class had been rattled, and no one seemed sure what would come next. But everyone knew one thing: something big was coming. The story of the confrontation in class had already started to spread, and with each retelling, the legend of the student's cryptic warning about his father grew. The power of his words had taken on a life of their own. At home, the student's mind was consumed with what he had done. He hadn't expected to stand up to Mrs. Hargrave in such a way, let alone to have the whole school talking about it. But as much as he tried to shake it off, he couldn't deny the weight of the situation. His father's influence was no secret, but he never liked to talk about it. It wasn't something he had ever used to his advantage, but now it seemed that the circumstances were different. The phone call came on the third day after the incident. The student had been in his room, scrolling through his phone, when the vibrations from his pocket startled him. He didn't recognize the number, but something inside told him to pick up. "Hello?" A gravelly voice on the other end made his heart skip a beat. "This is your father's office," the voice said. "We've been made aware of the situation at your school. We need to talk." His mind raced. He had no idea how they found out so quickly. Was it the teacher who had reported the incident? Or was someone else at school now aware of what had happened? The unease in his stomach grew heavier. "Is everything okay?" the voice asked, as though sensing his hesitation. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't know how this happened. I didn't mean for things to get this far." The voice on the other end was calm, almost reassuring. "Don't worry. We'll take care of it. You've done the right thing by speaking up. But now, we need to make sure it doesn't escalate any further." The call ended abruptly, leaving the student standing there, his mind spinning. Escalate? What did that mean? He had no idea what kind of steps his father would take, and that made him even more nervous. He had never been involved in anything like this before. But he couldn't deny the growing sense of power he felt knowing that, whether he liked it or not, his family's connections could help him in ways others couldn't even imagine. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hargrave had become a different version of herself. Her usual confidence was now tinged with uncertainty. The school had started to notice the change in her demeanor. She didn't hold the same sway over her students anymore, and she was acutely aware of the eyes that followed her around the building. It wasn't just the student who had spoken out. Others were beginning to notice the cracks in her armor. She knew deep down that she had made a mistake. But what terrified her even more was the nagging feeling that she hadn't seen the full extent of the danger. The student's father, whoever he was, had to be someone significant. She could no longer shake the sense of dread that lingered every time she walked into that classroom. Every interaction with the student felt charged now, as though the next words out of his mouth could be the final blow. It was on the 5th day after the confrontation that Mrs. Hargrave's fear reached a tipping point. She was in her office, sitting at her desk, when there was a sharp knock on the door. She looked up, startled, and without thinking, she motioned for whoever it was to enter. The door opened, and standing there in the doorway was a man she didn't recognize, tall, dark, and dressed in a suit that screamed authority. His presence was commanding, and he carried an air of calm that only seemed to increase her unease. "Mrs. Hargrave," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "I'm here on behalf of a very important person who has requested a meeting with you." Her heart skipped a beat. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but she had a sinking feeling that she was about to find out. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to maintain a semblance of control over the situation. The man smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you already know who I represent. And if you don't, you will soon." Mrs. Hargrave's pulse quickened. The words rang in her ears, a warning that she couldn't ignore. She had been hoping, praying that the whole situation would blow over, that the student's cryptic statements would turn out to be nothing more than the fantasies of a troubled kid. But now, standing face to face with someone who seemed to be part of something much bigger, she realized she had underestimated this situation entirely. As the man stepped forward and closed the door behind him, Mrs. Hargrave felt the air grow thicker. There was no turning back now. The consequences of her actions, the way she had treated that student, were coming for her. "Let's not waste time," the man said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of authority. "We have a lot to discuss." Back at school, the student had returned to his routine, but it felt different. It was as if the walls of the school were closing in on him, as though every step he took, every classroom he entered, was now somehow charged with the weight of his words. The students treated him differently, some with more respect, others with caution. And as for Mrs. Hargrave, he knew things were going to get worse for her. That afternoon, as he sat in the cafeteria, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building. The air seemed to hum with tension. He had done something, said something, that had set everything into motion. It wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore, it was about the impact of his actions, the ripple effect that was already beginning to spread through the school. Suddenly his phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out quickly, his heart beating faster as he saw the notification. The message was brief, and it left him with a sense of foreboding. "Meet me after school. We need to talk." It wasn't signed, but he knew immediately who it was from. His father's office. And with it, the overwhelming realization that the storm was about to break. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, and the student quickly gathered his things, his mind racing. The message on his phone had left him with more questions than answers. "Meet me after school. We need to talk." His heart pounded as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, trying to suppress the unease that crept through him. What did his father's office want? Was this about the confrontation with Mrs. Hargrave? Or was something else at play, something much bigger? He pushed through the crowd of students who were spilling out of the school, all heading in different directions, oblivious to the storm that seemed to be closing in on him. The usual noise of laughter and chatter felt distant, like he was walking through a tunnel. Everything seemed surreal, as if time had slowed down just for him. He made his way to the parking lot, his mind whirling. There was no way he could have known what awaited him. As he approached the spot where he had been told to meet, he spotted the car, a sleek black sedan parked near the back corner of the lot, its windows tinted, its engine purring softly as if waiting for him. The unease tightened in his chest. He had never seen this car before, nor had he seen the man who stood leaning against it. Tall and broad-shouldered, his features sharp, the stranger exuded an aura of authority and danger that sent a chill down the student's spine. "Come on over," the man called out when he saw the student approach. His voice was deep, commanding, yet strangely calm. The student hesitated for a moment but walked closer. As he did, the man pushed off from the car and opened the passenger side door. The student could see that the inside was dark, almost too dark for comfort, but there was no turning back now. He was already in too deep. "Get in," the man said, a hint of impatience in his voice. Reluctantly, the student slid into the car, trying not to show how much his hands were trembling. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing him in the darkness with this stranger. There was no escape now. His heart beat harder as he tried to gauge the man's intentions. For a moment, the car remained silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the engine. The man turned his head toward the student, his eyes piercing through the shadows. "I don't have time for pleasantries," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. "Let's get straight to the point." The student's pulse quickened. "What do you want with me?" The man's lips twisted into a tight, almost amused smile. "I'm here because your father wants to make sure things don't spiral out of control. You've already made quite an impression, haven't you?" The student frowned, confused. "My father? I don't understand what's going on." The man shifted in his seat, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze never leaving the student's. "Your father is. Well, he's someone who doesn't like to get his hands dirty. But he's aware of the situation with your teacher. He's also aware of how much attention you've brought to this little incident. And let's just say, there are people who don't appreciate that kind of disruption." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. People? Disruption? What had he done? He had thought standing up for himself would be enough, but now it seemed like he was caught in something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "What do you mean?" The words barely left his lips. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not just dealing with a teacher. There are powerful people who keep things running smoothly, who don't appreciate their power being questioned. They don't appreciate you making waves. And now, they want to make sure this all goes away. Before it gets worse." The car's interior felt even smaller now, the tension thick and suffocating. The student's mind raced. How had things escalated this quickly? What had he gotten himself into? Was his father really part of something like this? Was this the kind of influence his family had, dangerous, shadowy, with no clear line between right and wrong? Before he could respond, the man's phone buzzed, and he quickly glanced at the screen. A frown creased his forehead. "That's him," he muttered. "We need to move quickly." The stranger reached into the back seat, grabbing something from a briefcase he had left there. The student could see the glint of something metallic in the man's hand, an envelope, thick with papers. He held it out. "Take this," the man instructed. "It's all the information you need. Your father wants you to know what's going on, but you're going to have to make a choice. A big one." The student took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the cold paper. His mind was spinning. What could be in it? What was this choice he had to make? And why did it feel like the ground was slipping out from under him? The man continued, his tone now more intense. "This isn't just about your teacher anymore. This is about your future. You can either walk away from all this and pretend like it never happened, or you can step into a world where there's no going back. Where the stakes are higher than you can imagine." The student's heart raced, a mixture of fear and curiosity flooding his chest. "What kind of world?" he whispered, barely able to make the words come out. The man's gaze hardened. "A world where power, money, and influence dictate everything. A world where people like your teacher aren't even a blip on the radar. Where you get to choose how things unfold, and what kind of person you want to become." The student's hand tightened around the envelope, the weight of it feeling heavier now, as if it contained not just papers, but his fate. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to be part of this world, but now it was staring him in the face. Every part of him screamed to walk away, to refuse whatever deal the man was offering. But another part, the part that had stood up in class, the part that had declared he was done being invisible, whispered that this was his chance. And what if that chance didn't come around again? Before he could respond, the man reached for the door handle, his eyes locking onto the students. You have 24 hours. Don't waste them. With that, the door opened, and the man was gone, leaving the student sitting in the car, clutching the envelope, his mind reeling from the gravity of what had just happened. What choice could he possibly make? What would it mean for him and for everyone who had watched him step out from the shadows? The tension inside him was unbearable, and he knew this was only the beginning. He had no idea what the next 24 hours would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: everything had changed. And he was no longer just a student caught in a small, meaningless conflict. Now, he was part of something much larger, something that had the power to reshape everything he knew. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The next 24 hours dragged on like a weighty silence before a storm. The student spent every waking moment turning the man's words over and over in his mind. The envelope, now a constant presence in his hands, felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. Every glance at it made his pulse quicken. What was inside? What could it possibly reveal about his father, about the world he was being thrust into? As the clock ticked down, his decision became increasingly urgent. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. What would it mean to take the offer? What would happen if he refused? There was no telling what forces were watching him now. He had to act quickly. Finally, as dusk fell, the student found himself in a quiet corner of the school courtyard, away from the eyes of his peers. His heart pounded in his chest as he tore open the envelope. The papers inside were thick, the weight of them heavy with significance. His fingers trembled as he scanned the contents. It was all their details about his family's past, connections to powerful figures he had never known existed, and his father's involvement in a network of influence that spanned far beyond what he had imagined. The realization hit him like a slap. His father wasn't just a successful businessman. He was entrenched in a world of power, dangerous, shadowy, and unyielding. The student felt the ground beneath him shift. He had never asked for this life, never wanted any part of it. But it was undeniable now. His bloodline, his name, it all carried weight. Whether he liked it or not, he was a part of something that reached far beyond the classroom. As his mind raced, he knew the decision before him was impossible. There was no way to undo what had already been set into motion. His choice would determine everything: his future, his relationships, his identity. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a simple message: "Meet me in my office." Now. He knew who it was from before even reading it. The man. The messenger. The figure that had brought him into this world. The student didn't hesitate. He gathered the papers, stuffed them back into the envelope, and hurried out of the courtyard, his thoughts a blur. The car was waiting for him again in the same spot, black, sleek, silent. He slipped inside without a word, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a vice. The man was already there, sitting in the front seat, his face unreadable. "Did you make your decision?" the man asked, his voice calm but with a steel edge that made it clear he wasn't interested in small talk. The student swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've made my decision." The man turned slightly to look at him. "Good. It's time you realized what kind of power you have. You won't get another chance like this." But before the student could respond, man's phone buzzed. He checked it quickly, his face going pale. "Change of plans," he muttered under his breath. He quickly started the car and sped down the street, the engine roaring as they drove further from the school. The student had no idea what was going on, but the shift in the man's demeanor was enough to send another wave of unease through him. Something had changed, and he wasn't sure what. Minutes later, they arrived at an unfamiliar building, tall, imposing, with dark windows that seemed to watch them as they approached. The man got out of the car without a word, and the student followed him, unsure of what to expect next. They entered through a side door into a hallway that felt colder than the night air outside. Inside the building, the atmosphere was oppressive. The walls were lined with shadows, and the low hum of voices echoed in the distance. The students' footsteps echoed in the hallway, each one heavier than the last. They reached an elevator, and the man pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator ascended, the student felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His decision, whatever it had been, felt insignificant now. The world was moving too fast, and he was struggling to keep up. The doors opened with a soft chime, and they stepped into a room that was unlike any he had ever seen. It was grand, luxurious, but there was something about it that made his skin crawl. Sitting at the far end of the room behind an enormous desk was a figure he recognized immediately: his father. But this wasn't the father he knew. The man before him was colder, harder. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark and distant. He looked up from the papers on his desk as they entered, a brief flicker of recognition crossing his face. "So," his father said, his voice distant, as if they weren't connected by blood. "You've made it this far. Congratulations." The student's heart skipped a beat. "What is this? What's going on?" His father didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, studying him with an intensity that made the student's throat go dry. "You think you know everything. You think you've made your choice. But you haven't." The words hung in the air like a weight. The student's confusion deepened. What was happening? He had thought the man he had met, the one who had handed him the envelope, was there to guide him, to offer him a way out, a chance to join the world his father was a part of. But now it seemed like that was only the beginning. "You're just a pawn in a much larger game," his father continued, his voice cold. "This isn't about power or money. It's about control. About keeping the world in balance. And you, my son, have been groomed for this your entire life." The student's world tilted. He had thought he had the choice to walk away, to refuse what had been offered. But now, faced with his father's words, he realized how wrong he had been. There was no walking away from this. He had been part of the game from the beginning, whether he knew it or not. "Everything you've done, every decision you've made, has been for this moment," his father added, his eyes narrowing. "And you thought you had the power. But in truth, you've never had any control at all." The student felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" His father smiled, then a slow, knowing smile that sent a shock through him. "You're not the only one who has been watched. The man you met? He's not here to help you. He's here to test you. To see if you have what it takes to survive in this world. But the real question is, do you have the stomach for it?" The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. The world he had been so eager to join wasn't what he thought it was. It was a world of manipulation, control, and deceit. His father hadn't been preparing him to rise to power, he had been preparing him to be another cog in the machine. A machine that was far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The student's heart raced as the final realization dawned on him. Everything he had been told, every move he had made, had been part of a much bigger plan, a plan that had already been set in motion long before he ever knew. And now, the real test was about to begin. The student's head swirled with 100 conflicting thoughts, all fighting for dominance. His father's words echoed in his ears, but it was the coldness of the room that struck him hardest. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an unveiling. A realization that nothing in his life had been his own choice. His father's icy gaze didn't soften, and the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. He had believed he was in control, that his actions had led him here, but now the truth was undeniable. He was just another player in a game he didn't even understand. "You have a decision to make, son," his father's voice cut through the heavy silence. "But I'm done pretending you have any real options." The student stood frozen, a mix of fear and disbelief paralyzing him. All his life, he had believed in the value of his choices. He had thought that if he just worked hard enough, if he just fought for what was right, he could change things. But now it seemed like everything he had done, every move he had made, had been orchestrated long before he even understood the stakes. His father's tone grew sharper, as if sensing his son's hesitation. "I've spent years building this empire, and it's not just for me. It's for the future. It's for you." The finality in his father's words sent a chill through him. This wasn't an offer, it was a demand. The student clenched his fists, the weight of the decision pressing down on him harder than ever. His mind raced. Was this what he wanted? Was this the life he had imagined for himself? His thoughts flew back to Mrs. Hargrave and the way she had humiliated him. He had thought standing up to her was the hardest thing he'd ever do. But that was before he realized the truth about his father's influence, before he understood that he was caught in a much larger scheme. A game where the rules were made by people like his father, and where his own life was nothing more than a tool to be used. His father's eyes narrowed, studying him intently. "You can choose to walk away if you want, but understand this, people like us never walk away. We make decisions, and we live with them." His voice dropped lower, harder, a warning disguised as advice. "If you think you can escape this world, you're wrong. It's in your blood, whether you like it or not." The student's thoughts churned like a storm. His life was no longer his own. His father had been manipulating him, preparing him for this moment from the very beginning. But could he really walk away? Could he take the step into a different life, one where he wasn't defined by his family's power, one where he could just be himself, away from the dangerous, shadowy world his father had built? "Don't let your pride make the decision for you," his father continued, his voice growing cold again. "You can fight it, but you'll lose. Trust me, you're not the first to try." The student's mind raced, but this time, it wasn't the fear that guided him. It was clarity. He didn't want to be a pawn in his father's game. He didn't want to live a life dictated by power, control, and influence. He had thought that by accepting the offer, he could change things from the inside. But now, with every word his father spoke, he realized the truth: he couldn't change anything. He was part of a machine that was too big, too powerful for him to even fathom, and the only way to break free was to walk away from it entirely. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what would happen to him after he left the world his father had prepared for him. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't be part of it any longer. "I'm not doing it," the student said, his voice firm. It was the first time he had spoken with conviction in what felt like forever. "I'm not going to live in your world." For a long moment, his father didn't say anything. The silence hung thick, like the calm before a storm. The student stood his ground, feeling more alive than he ever had before. He knew the consequences wouldn't be simple. He knew his father's world wouldn't let him go without a fight. But the decision was made. "You're a fool," his father finally said, his voice low, venomous. "You'll regret this. I can promise you that." But the student didn't flinch. His heart pounded in his chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was freedom. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a choice that was his own. The years of preparation, the manipulation, the pressure, it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't going to be part of that world. "I'm done," the student said quietly, turning toward the door. The cold stare of his father followed him as he walked out of the room, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to. As he stepped into the elevator, the weight of his decision settled in. The truth was, he had no idea what came next. He didn't know how he would survive without the connections, the power, the influence that had been offered to him. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to live a life controlled by his father's shadows. He was going to find his own path, no matter how difficult it might be. The elevator doors closed, and the descent felt like a release. It was the first breath of fresh air he had had in a long time. The decision to walk away from everything he had known was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. He didn't need his father's world. He didn't need the manipulations, the lies, the control. He needed his own life. And that was worth fighting for. As the car sped away from the building, the student's mind cleared. He wasn't sure where he would go next or what the future would hold. The world outside had changed, and he had changed with it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt free. He had chosen his own path, and that was more powerful than anything he could have inherited from his father. The city passed by in a blur, and the student found himself at a crossroads. There was no turning back now, but there was also no need for regret. He had made his choice, and that was all that mattered. The power, the manipulation, the games, they weren't his. They never had been. And as the car disappeared into the distance, the only thing the student could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, steady, unwavering, and finally free.